Telangana presents a sharp developmental contrast. The state is rapidly modernizing, driving high economic growth, and actively deploying new child protection schemes. Yet, this chart tracks a disturbing and undeniable upward trajectory. From 2014 to 2019, the volume of registered child abuse cases under the POCSO Act climbed year over year. When you parse the state-level data, the severity concentrates on the most vulnerable demographics. Minors with cognitive disabilities face a high risk of systemic, repeated abuse. We routinely see the fatal limits of the current safety net. Recent local headlines detailed a 5-year-old boy who was smothered and beaten to death by his mother's live-in partner. The threat is intimately proximal. This exposes a central paradox in child safety policy. Telangana has steadily increased the strictness of its POCSO legal framework, yet these harsher penalties have not reduced the occurrence of the crimes. The criminal justice system operates on a post-facto timeline. By design, a legal framework can only react, investigate, and punish once the trauma has already been inflicted on the child. This failure of deterrence forces a shift in strategy. Instead of reactive policing, the investigation must move toward mapping actual threat vectors and building resilience directly into the child's daily environment. Reactive legal models are mathematically incapable of preventing a systemic vulnerability crisis. To achieve actual protection, the infrastructure of child safety must be moved upstream, directly into the educational system. To understand why deterrence fails, we have to profile the exact demographics of the perpetrators operating in Telangana. A criminological analysis of Telangana shows the stranger danger scenario is statistically negligible. 99.7% of abuse cases against cognitively disabled minors involve a known actor. Breaking down this massive block reveals abusers are family members, institutional staff, and immediate neighbors. Cognitive disability creates a unique systemic vulnerability. Total dependency on caregivers forms an insulated environment where boundary violations are normalized and masked from outside observers. Now, evaluate the state's legal response against that reality. In 2021, authorities registered 2,567 POSCO cases in Telangana. When thousands of complex domestic incidents enter the judicial pipeline, the legal infrastructure experiences a massive logistical bottleneck. The output is striking. Out of thousands of registrations, data shows only 44 convictions. That is an approximate 1.7 analytical. Relying on courtrooms to solve domestic and institutional behavioral problems represents a design flaw that persists regardless of police effort. Because perpetrators operate inside the home with near zero legal risk, the child's daily ecosystem must be armed with its own early detection and defense mechanisms. Sexual abuse cases represent the most visible outcome of a broader, unmanaged school ecosystem. We have to widen the lens to the general educational environment. Recent state assessments by PARAC and AZER provide a clear baseline of the socio-emotional health of Telangana's student body. This radar chart maps compounding risks. 82.5% of adolescents use social media at home. Mental health data shows 14% report persistent sadness and intense stress. Finally, an 8% teenage pregnancy rate completes the chart, revealing a massive, overlapping risk area. This high digital exposure introduces direct grooming vulnerabilities. For socially isolated or cognitively challenged students, an unmonitored device is a direct vector for predators. In an environment lacking integrated socio-emotional safeguards, school-related gender-based violence thrives as a normalized behavior. The state has deployed reactive measures, like the TMREIS complaint boxes and police she-teams. These are critical triage tools, but they ultimately treat the symptoms rather than the root causes. Without an integrated curriculum dedicated to well-being, children remain developmentally blind to grooming tactics, cyber threats, and boundary violations. They have no framework to identify the danger until a crisis forces an intervention. The architectural solution requires rewriting the baseline of how schools operate, detailed in a recent policy brief by UNICEF and the Enfold Proactive Health Trust. The proposal centers on institutionalizing a continuous value education framework. Instead of isolated one-off seminars, these pillars run consistently across classes 1 through 10. The framework rests on specific, interconnected topics: socio-emotional learning, gender equity, personal safety education, and digital citizenship. This requires a pedagogical shift. For example, the biology curriculum in grades 6 through 10 must evolve beyond basic reproductive mechanics to cover holistic emotional and physiological development. It also requires a shift in discipline. Traditional punitive responses mirror the failing criminal justice system. The alternative is embedding restorative practices into the classroom. This image shows a restorative circle from the field. Notice the non-hierarchical, peer-to-peer physical layout. The environment dictates the interaction. Fear-based compliance is replaced by embedded ground rules. Institutionalizing this framework engineers out the socio-emotional blind spots that proximal predators rely on to operate undetected. When you place the current reactive model next to the proposed educational model, the difference in public safety is stark. On the reactive timeline, an isolated child experiences abuse, but lacks the vocabulary to report it. The trauma persists until it hits a failing legal bottleneck. On the proactive timeline, a supported child identifies a boundary violation immediately. The gap between incident and intervention collapses. Executing this requires leveraging existing state mechanisms. Institutions like SCIRT and local diet centers must be utilized to implement comprehensive, large-scale teacher training. Educational policy can no longer afford to treat student well-being as an extracurricular luxury. It must be a non-negotiable core of the curriculum. You cannot legislate away proximal abuse if the victims lack the autonomy, the support system, and the vocabulary to identify it in their own homes. A resilient educational ecosystem that stops an offense before it occurs provides a more accurate metric of safety than counting charge sheets after the fact.